Welcome to Candlelight Mystery, where every tale begins with a flicker of suspense and unfolds into shadows of intrigue. Join us as we step into quiet villages, haunted paths, and whispered secrets. Light your candle, steady your breath, and let the mystery guide you into the unknown, waiting for you. The countryside slept under a blanket of calm, its winding lanes glowing softly in the candlelight of dusk. But beneath the quiet charm lay secrets sharp enough to cut. When the respected Colonel Harwood's body washed ashore at Willow Lake, the village whispered, but no one dared speak the truth aloud. Strange footprints vanished into the woods, a torn map drifted in the reeds. And somewhere among the smiling neighbours walked a killer who knew the terrain better than anyone. As Miss Marple observed from her garden gate, and Poirot adjusted his cuffs, the game of shadows had already begun. Chapter 1. A Stillness Before the Storm. The village of Willowbrook looked as if it had been painted for some idealized postcard. Whitewashed cottages with thatched roofs, neat little gardens pruned within an inch of their lives, and a church spire that rose modestly above the elms, never daring to be grand. It was the kind of place where time did not seem to move forward so much as circle quietly around the same familiar routines. On this particular evening, the sky wore a soft lilac haze, melting slowly into the deeper blue of oncoming night. Willow Lake, half a mile from the village, held the sky's reflection in a glassy stillness. Dragonflies flickered over the water like stray sparks. From a distance there was nothing at all to suggest that anything was wrong. Miss Jane Marple, small and quietly alert in her armchair by the sitting-room window, was adding a few more rows to a pale blue baby cardigan. Her needles clicked in a gentle rhythm that matched the pendulum clock on the mantelpiece. Now and then, she looked up over her spectacles at the lane outside. It was a habit she would never have called surveillance. In her mind, she was only taking an interest. The lane offered its usual little parade of life. Young Mary Fletcher cycled past on her bicycle, a basket full of bread from the bakery. Old Mr. Tulliver shuffled along with his stick, hat at an angle that suggested he had once been more dashing. A pair of children dashed by, trailing laughter, and a dog, ordinary, really very safe, very English. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Safe, she thought, is what people like to believe. It very often is not strictly true. She had lived long enough and observed long enough to know that beneath peaceful surfaces often ran eddies of resentment, envy, fear, and folly. Village life merely wrapped them in roses and clean curtains. There was, for instance, Colonel Harwood. She could see the tall man in her mind's eye even now, ramrod straight, moustache clipped, voice firm. A widower of several years, he had settled near Willowbrook after leaving the army, purchasing a handsome stone house not far from the lake. He had a reputation for integrity, for strong opinions, and for knowing everyone's business without necessarily appearing to pry. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, pausing in her knitting, when one knows everyone's business, one also knows their weak points. Colonel Harwood had been seen 2 days ago striding towards the lake just before dusk. He had not been seen returning. That in itself would not be cause for alarm. He sometimes walked a circuit that took him right through the woods and out to the far road. But Miss Marple had heard something else this morning, spoken in a hushed, fluttering tone at the grocer's. "Missing," they said. Mrs. Wilkes, the postmistress, had whispered. "The housekeeper hasn't seen him since Thursday, and he never misses his breakfast, not the Colonel, very particular about his bacon." Miss Marple had merely looked thoughtful, her fingers selecting tomatoes with a little more care than usual. Now, at her window, she folded the half-finished cardigan on her lap. The moment of decision passed across her face like the faintest of breezes. "I think," she said softly, "I shall go for a little walk." She put on her sensible hat and her thick-soled walking shoes, fetched her old but polished handbag, and stepped out into the early evening. A light smell of damp earth and cut grass rose from the gardens. She walked with the measured pace of an elderly lady with no particular urgency, exactly as she wished to appear. As she neared the fork in the road, she noticed something unexpected, a motor car that did not belong to the village. It was a sleek, dark vehicle, standing out like a well-dressed foreigner at a rustic gathering. It was parked before the inn, the Willowbrook Arms, whose sign creaked a little as it swayed in the faint breeze. Miss Marple paused, taking in the details. The car bore a London registration. Its chrome gleamed with the sort of polish that suggests both pride and a certain fastidiousness. The driver's door was locked. The inn door stood slightly ajar. Voices drifted faintly from within. Visitors, she thought, and at such a time. Her curiosity piqued. She continued past the inn for the moment, choosing the lane that led towards Willow Lake. The hedges grew higher here, the road narrower, and bird song louder. The air felt cooler as she approached the water, the faint scent of wet stone and wild mint riding on the breeze. As she emerged from the lane and the view opened onto the lake, she saw them, 3 figures standing near the shore, their shapes dark against the fading light. One was Inspector Graves from the nearby town, a stocky man with a heavy jaw and a coat that always seemed one size too large. Another was the local constable, young and trying to look older with a serious expression. The third figure, that was interesting. He was of medium height, impeccably dressed in a light grey suit, with a hat at his feet and a pair of gleaming shoes oddly incongruous with the muddy bank. His posture was upright but relaxed, and his hands were folded neatly behind his back as he looked down at something by the water's edge. Miss Marple did not need to come much closer to guess what that something must be. An ambulance van, its back doors open, waited a short distance away. 2 men in uniforms stood nearby, their faces subdued. She advanced quietly until Inspector Graves saw her and let out a small sigh of mingled resignation and respect. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said. "I suppose there's no keeping news from you." She smiled, mild and apologetic. "Oh, my dear Inspector, you know how village tongues wag. I only came for a little walk." "But I see." She let her eyes drift meaningfully to the covered form on the ground, a pale blanket drawn over a man's outline. "It is Colonel Harwood, then?" Inspector Graves nodded, his expression grim. "Yes. Found about an hour ago, half in the reeds. Looks like he slipped and struck his head. Perhaps heart trouble, hard to say yet." The third man turned at that, and Miss Marple found herself under the steady, appraising gaze of a stranger with precise features and dark, intelligent eyes. "Forgive me," he said, in a voice touched by a faint Belgian accent, "but I should not be too quick to assume, Inspector. The head wound, you see, is on the wrong side for a simple fall from that direction." His gaze shifted briefly to the slope and the arrangement of stones along the shore. "I took the liberty of observing," he added modestly, "while I waited." Inspector Graves made a disgruntled noise. "Always some difficulty with these things," he muttered. "Miss Marple, this is—" "Hercule Poirot," Miss Marple thought, before the name was spoken. She had heard of him, of course. His reputation had travelled far beyond London drawing-rooms and foreign hotels. The description had always included the word meticulous. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot," the inspector finished, "staying at the inn for a few days. Came upon the scene when the boy here raised the alarm." Poirot inclined his head stiffly but politely. "How do you do, miss?" "Marple," she said. "Jane Marple. I live in the village." Her eyes, clear and blue, met his with unassuming calm. "You were quite right, Monsieur Poirot. Things are so rarely as simple as they first appear, especially where people are concerned." He regarded her with a trace of surprise and, perhaps, interest. "Indeed, mademoiselle," he said softly. "On that point, I suspect we are in agreement." The evening deepened around them. On the gentle surface of Willow Lake, the sky's reflection trembled, as if something had just disturbed the depths below. The body of Colonel Harwood was carried away with a professional briskness that seemed, to Miss Marple, almost indecent in its speed. Life, however, insisted on continuing in its usual patterns, as it always did, even in the presence of death. The constable marked off the immediate shoreline with a length of cord. Inspector Graves grumbled about paperwork and post-mortems. The last traces of the day's light slipped quietly behind the trees. Miss Marple, having offered no more than a few brief, politely phrased observations, stepped aside and watched. She had long ago learned that one sees most when one does not seem to be looking at anything in particular. Monsieur Poirot, in contrast, examined the ground with a concentration that almost made the air tense around him. He took out a small notebook, scribbled a few words, then bent to observe the slope above the water. His patent leather shoes remained spotless despite the mud. It was, Miss Marple thought, with private amusement, a small miracle in itself. "You see, Inspector," Poirot was saying, "there are scuff marks here." He indicated a shallow disturbance in the earth. "But they are not quite where one would expect if the Colonel slipped of his own accord. And there," he pointed to a faint line leading away from the reeds. "Something was dragged, or perhaps someone. The pattern is, how do you say, inconsistent with a mere accident." Inspector Graves frowned. "You're suggesting someone helped him into the lake? That's a serious statement, Monsieur Poirot." "I suggest nothing yet," Poirot replied evenly. "I merely note that the earth, it has its own story to tell." Miss Marple's fingers folded more tightly around the leather strap of her handbag. "The earth does indeed tell stories," she thought. "So do people, though theirs are usually less reliable." She cleared her throat very gently. "Inspector, if I might say a word?" Graves glanced at her with resigned tolerance. He had crossed paths with Miss Marple before, and while he would never openly admit it, he had found her contributions annoyingly useful. "Yes, Miss Marple?" "I don't pretend to understand scuff marks and such," she said modestly, "but I did notice last week that Colonel Harwood was, how shall I put it, unusually tense. There were 2 separate occasions when I saw him speaking rather sharply to a gentleman near the post office, a stranger, dark coat, hat pulled low. I remember, because the Colonel does not often lose his temper in public." Inspector Graves straightened slightly. "Stranger, you say? We've no report of any stranger lodging in the village recently." Miss Marple nodded. "That is exactly why I noticed him. In a place like Willowbrook, strangers stand out, and when they argue with residents, they stand out rather more." Poirot turned his full attention to her, his dark eyes intent. "Pardon, mademoiselle, but details such as these are often the little grey cell's best friends. Could you describe this man more precisely?" She tilted her head, thinking, tallish, not so tall as the Colonel, but more than average, slender build, I would say, perhaps in his 40s. His coat was good quality, but a little worn at the cuffs, someone who had seen better days, perhaps. His accent was English, but there was something a little forced about his politeness. "And the nature of the argument?" Poirot asked. "I did not hear every word," Miss Marple said. "But I distinctly caught, 'You have no right from the Colonel,' and the other gentleman replied something like, 'You'll regret this.' It's the sort of phrase one remembers." Inspector Graves scribbled the description in his notebook, trying not to look impressed. "We'll ask around, see if anyone else noticed him, might have stayed at a nearby village, or just passed through." Poirot's gaze drifted back towards the water. "Tell me, Inspector," he said, "has anyone checked Colonel Harwood's house?" "Housekeeper reported him missing this morning," Graves replied. "Constable went to have a look. Nothing out of place, according to him. We'll search more thoroughly now, of course." "Bien," Poirot murmured. "For now, it will tell us more about the man than this poor, unfortunate scene." Miss Marple caught the faintest hint of scepticism in his voice regarding the constable's "nothing out of place." She shared that scepticism, though for different reasons. Young men, she had found, were rarely as observant as they believed themselves to be. "Would it be very improper," she asked mildly, "if I were to walk back with you, Inspector? I knew the Colonel, you see, only a little, but one might notice small things." Graves hesitated, then shrugged. "I suppose there's no harm. And you, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot placed his hat carefully back onto his head. "I shall accompany you as well, if I may. I have no wish to intrude, but if there is even the smallest chance that this is not an accident—" "Then you'd rather know," Graves finished, a touch wry. "Very well, let's go up together." The path from the lake to Colonel Harwood's house wound gently uphill, flanked by low stone walls mottled with moss. As they walked, the village lights began to kindle one by one a warm glow in cottage windows, the inviting lamps of the inn, the dim outline of the church lantern. In the distance, a dog barked, a cart rattled past, someone laughed. Willowbrook, in spite of everything, remained itself. "You have known Colonel Harwood long, Miss Marple?" Poirot asked as they walked. "About 4 years," she replied. "Since he bought the house here. He was very particular, you know, very orderly, a place for everything and everything in its place. People like that are rarely careless near lakes and slippery stones." Poirot nodded slowly. "Exactitude. It becomes a habit. It is not easily set aside." "And he had enemies?" he added gently. Miss Marple smiled a little sadly. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, everyone has enemies. Most of us are simply fortunate enough to have enemies who are too lazy or too decent to do anything about it." Inspector Graves made a faint snort. "You make it sound as if murder might be lurking behind every hedge, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she said, "not every hedge, only some of them." They came in sight of Colonel Harwood's house at last, a solid, dignified structure of grey stone with ivy climbing one side. The windows on the ground floor glowed warmly, while those above stared dark and blank toward the sky. A nervous-looking woman in an apron hovered in the doorway. She wrung her hands when she saw the trio approach. "Inspector, is it?" she began. "Yes, Mrs. Finch," Graves said gently. "I'm afraid it is. Colonel Harwood is dead." She let out a small, strangled sob and covered her face. Poirot watched her keenly, noting the way her shoulders shook, the way her fingers clutched the apron. Miss Marple watched as well, but she watched something quite different. The direction of the woman's gaze when she lowered her hands, the way her eyes flicked quick as a nervous bird's towards the staircase inside. Not towards the study, nor the dining room, nor the kitchen towards the stairs. "You have been with the Colonel long, Mrs. Finch?" Miss Marple asked gently. 6 years, ma'am," the housekeeper sniffed. "He was a good master, strict, but fair. Oh, dear Lord, I knew something awful had happened when he didn't come back last night. And the letter—" She stopped herself abruptly, as if a hand had clamped over her own mouth. Poirot's brows lifted a fraction. "The letter, madame?" Mrs. Finch paled. I only meant he received so many letters. I didn't mean anything by it." "Oh, but you did," Miss Marple thought, though she didn't say it aloud. Poirot, however, stepped no further into the silence. "Perhaps we might see the Colonel's study," he said smoothly. "Inspector, with your permission, there may be papers that will tell us what weighed upon his mind before he died." Graves nodded. "All right. Mrs. Finch, show us the study, if you please." As they stepped into the house, the air seemed to change. Gone was the fresh, open scent of lake and trees. Here was the faint aroma of pipe tobacco, old books, and polished wood. It felt, to Miss Marple, as if they had crossed an invisible border from the innocent surface of Willowbrook into some private, more shadowed country. In that moment, she had a distinct, quiet conviction. Colonel Harwood's death was no accident. And as she glanced briefly at Hercule Poirot, she was quite certain that he thought exactly the same. The countryside, she reflected, might look peaceful, but tonight she could feel very clearly that something dark had stirred beneath its charming, carefully kept surface. Chapter 2. Shadows Among the Villagers. The next morning dawned with a sky so pale it seemed undecided about becoming day at all. A heavy mist clung to Willow Lake and drifted between the cottages like a quiet visitor unwilling to leave. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, wavering ribbons. Birds called sporadically, their voices muffled by the fog. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen table slicing a small loaf of bread. Her mind, however, was far from breakfast. The previous evening's events replayed themselves in her thoughts with the clarity of a lantern-lit picture show. Colonel Harwood still formed by the water, Poirot's sharp observations, Mrs. Finch's fearful glance toward the staircase, and most of all the sense that something was deeply wrong beneath Willowbrook's calm surface. She buttered her toast with a steady but thoughtful hand. Murder, or even the suspicion of murder, was like yeast, she always thought. It made everything rise unpleasantly. People said more, whispered more, hid more, and in a village, secrets had a way of wriggling out through the smallest cracks. A knock sounded softly on her front door. Miss Marple set down her knife, smoothed her skirt, and opened the door with gentle curiosity. Monsieur Hercule Poirot stood on her threshold, immaculate as ever despite the damp air. His coat was spotless, his hat perfectly angled, and even his moustache appeared immune to humidity. He held a leather notebook tucked neatly under one arm. "Good morning, Mademoiselle Marple," he said with a courteous inclination of his head. "May I impose upon your time for just a few minutes?" "Not an imposition at all," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Do come in, Monsieur Poirot. I was just having breakfast." Poirot stepped inside with the air of a man entering a chapel, respectful, observant, appreciative of order. He glanced at the tidy kitchen, the polished teapot, the neatly folded napkins. "Your home, mademoiselle, reflects a mind of precision," he said. Miss Marple smiled modestly. "I like to think it reflects a mind that dislikes clutter." They sat at the table, where Miss Marple poured tea with smooth familiarity. "I wished to consult you," Poirot began, "on several matters concerning the late Colonel Harwood." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Of course." Poirot opened his notebook. "You mentioned seeing a stranger arguing with the Colonel last week. I have made inquiries this morning at the inn and the post office, but it seems no such man was officially registered as a visitor." "That does not surprise me," Miss Marple said. "A man who wishes not to be noticed rarely signs his name in guest books." "Just so," Poirot agreed. "But I wonder, did you see the stranger enter or leave any particular house?" Miss Marple thought for a moment. "Not a house, no, but I did see him go into the woods. He carried a walking stick, the sort with a carved handle, unusual really, and he walked very swiftly, with purpose." Poirot scribbled a note. "Bon, already this helps us." Miss Marple hesitated, then added quietly, "He looked troubled, someone under strain. One sees that expression on men who have something to lose." Poirot gave her a look of genuine admiration. "Your instincts, mademoiselle, are formidable. I knew as much last night." Miss Marple waved off the compliment with gentle dismissal. "One sees a great deal, living in the countryside. People imagine no one is watching them, you see." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And what do you make of Colonel Harwood himself? You said he was tense." "He was," Miss Marple said. "For several weeks now, his temper was shorter. He kept to himself more. Mrs. Finch told me last Thursday that he had locked his study door twice in one morning. Unusual for him." Poirot's eyes brightened. "Ah, locked doors, private meetings, sudden changes of temperament, these are the patterns that lead to murder." Miss Marple nodded. "And then there was the letter." Poirot looked sharply up. "Mrs. Finch mentioned it only accidentally." "Yes, and she regretted doing so immediately." Poirot considered this, tapping the table lightly with one finger. If the letter was important, then it might still be in the house. Inspector Graves promised to search thoroughly today. "You and I both know Inspector Graves does honest work," Miss Marple said gently, "but not subtle work." Poirot's moustache twitched in agreement. "Precisely why I intend to visit the Colonel's house again, and I hoped, perhaps, you would join me." Miss Marple blinked. "You wish for my help?" "Indeed," Poirot said sincerely. "There are truths you see with your, how shall I put it, your knowledge of human nature. And there are truths I see with logic. Together we may achieve more than alone." Miss Marple felt a quiet warmth of amusement. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot, but we must tread delicately. People talk, especially when they fear something. Poirot stood. Then let us begin. They stepped into the lane, walking side by side toward Colonel Harwood's house. The morning fog was thinning now, revealing Willowbrook in fragmented glimpses. A cat on a wall, a milk cart on the corner, Mrs. Carter sweeping her doorstep as though her broom could drive away unpleasant news. People greeted Miss Marple with polite nods, and Poirot with curious glances. Some whispered behind hands. News travelled fast in the countryside. As they passed the bakery, the owner, Mrs. Hargreaves, leaned out with the air of someone struggling not to gossip. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she exclaimed. "Terrible. Poor Colonel Harwood, gone just like that." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. "Yes, very sad." Mrs. Hargreaves lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, they say he didn't fall at all. They say someone may have pushed him. Imagine, murder in Willowbrook." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "And who is they, madame?" Mrs. Hargreaves froze, suddenly remembering who she was speaking to. "Oh, I didn't mean anything, just talk, you understand, just talk." Poirot murmured, "Ah, village talk. It is never without a seed of truth." Miss Marple pressed gently. "Has anyone said who might have quarrelled with the Colonel recently?" Mrs. Hargreaves swallowed, then pointed with her chin toward a lane branching right. "Well, some say Mr. Alfred Pritchard wasn't pleased with the Colonel. Something about land boundaries. They had words last month." Poirot made a thoughtful sound. Miss Marple thanked the baker, and they continued toward the Colonel's house. "Land disputes," Poirot mused. "They are most fertile soil for hostility. And Mr. Pritchard is not a patient man," Miss Marple added softly. "But I've never known him to be violent." Poirot glanced sideways at her. "Violence, mademoiselle, is often committed not by the violent but by the desperate." As they approached the house, the front door stood open, and raised voices drifted out. Inspector Graves's barked orders and Mrs. Finch's anxious replies echoed through the hallway. Poirot and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. The investigation had begun in earnest. And yet neither of them could shake the feeling that the real trouble in Willowbrook had only just begun. Colonel Harwood's stone house looked even more imposing in daylight. The sharp morning light caught on its leaded windows, giving them the stern expression of an old soldier standing guard. The ivy that climbed its walls fluttered in the soft wind, but the atmosphere around the house held a certain tension, like a room just after someone has left in anger. Inspector Graves stood in the hallway, sleeves rolled up, frustration tightening his features. Beside him hovered Mrs. Finch, wringing her hands so fiercely it seemed a wonder she hadn't twisted her apron into a rope. The moment Poirot and Miss Marple stepped inside, Graves sighed heavily. "Oh, it's you two," he muttered. "I suppose you're here to offer suggestions." Poirot straightened his cuffs. "I am here to assist, Inspector, as is Miss Marple." Graves scratched his head. "Well, we've searched the study top to bottom. No suspicious letters, no hidden diaries, nothing." Miss Marple's blue eyes sparkled. "Dear Inspector, did you look under things?" "We opened every drawer." "Yes," she said gently, "but at times important items are kept where one wouldn't expect them. Under rugs, behind picture frames, inside books rather than desks." Graves grunted. "The constables will get to all that." Poirot's gaze drifted upward toward the staircase. "Madame Finch," he said softly, "last night, when you learned of the Colonel's death, you looked toward the stairs. Why?" Mrs. Finch froze, her hands knotted together. "Oh, I don't know. I suppose I was upset." "But your eyes," Poirot interrupted softly. "Your eyes betrayed habit. You looked instinctively. Something upstairs requires your concern." Tears welled in Mrs. Finch's eyes. "It's not my fault," she cried suddenly. "I didn't do anything wrong. The Colonel told me to keep quiet." Inspector Graves stepped forward sharply. "Keep quiet about what?" Mrs. Finch sniffed miserably, then swallowed hard. "The locked room." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. Locked room? Miss Marple's expression remained kind. Will you show us, Mrs. Finch? The trembling woman nodded reluctantly and led them up the stairs. Each step creaked faintly beneath their weight. At the top, she turned right and stopped before a door near the end of the corridor. A brass keyhole glinted under the dim hallway light. He kept this room locked for months, Mrs. Finch whispered. Never let anyone inside, and when I asked him about it, he told me to mind my own affairs. Poirot leaned close to the door, examining it. And the key? Mrs. Finch bit her lip. He kept it on a ring in his coat pocket. But last week, he moved it. I saw him slip it into his desk drawer. Inspector Graves crossed his arms. We checked every drawer. Miss Marple tapped her chin lightly. But did you check behind the drawers? Graves blinked. Behind them? Yes, she said. Old furniture often has gaps behind the drawer runners. People hide things there. Oh, for heaven's sake, Graves muttered, stomping downstairs. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned to Poirot with a small, amused smile. Young men do try, you know, but they haven't lived long enough to understand the many ways people conceal. Poirot returned her smile with one equally warm. You and I, mademoiselle, we understand concealment very well. They waited. After a few minutes, heavy footsteps came pounding up the stairs again. Inspector Graves appeared, red-faced, breathless, and holding a small brass key. It was wedged behind the drawer, he grumbled. How on earth you guessed that? Miss Marple smiled modestly. Human nature, Inspector. He jammed the key into the lock. With a rusty click, the door creaked open. Mrs. Finch gasped. Poirot and Miss Marple stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The curtains were drawn, leaving the room in a grey, dim light. It was not an ordinary bedroom, it was more like a private retreat. Bookshelves lined the walls. A heavy writing desk sat in the centre. A faded armchair faced a small fireplace. But the most striking feature was the map spread across the desk, an enormous hand-drawn map of Willowbrook and its surrounding lands, marked with red ink. Miss Marple approached slowly. Poirot followed, eyes narrowed in sharp calculation. Land boundaries, Poirot murmured. Ah, the Colonel was making inquiries. Miss Marple leaned over the map. Look here, Monsieur Poirot, the Pritchard property line. It overlaps with Colonel Harwood's by several yards. That would certainly cause tension. Inspector Graves frowned. A land dispute? That's hardly motive for murder. Poirot shook his head. No, Inspector. But look closer. These markings here, these are not simple boundaries. This is a surveyor's map. Someone was planning something. Miss Marple traced one red line with her finger. And this section leads toward the old cottage in the woods, the one that's been abandoned for years. Poirot's eyes lit with understanding. The stranger, he whispered. He was seen in the woods. Inspector Graves rubbed his chin. So, the Colonel and this mystery man, their argument might have been about land, boundaries, money? Poirot nodded slowly. Or something hidden in those woods. Miss Marple added softly, Old cottages hold old secrets. Mrs. Finch hugged her arms tightly. Is that why he kept the room locked? To hide the map? Poirot turned his gaze toward the fireplace. Perhaps, but what is this? He crouched down, picking up a small piece of burned paper from the hearth. Only a corner remained just enough to show a fragment of handwriting. Miss Marple peered closer. It looks like a letter. Poirot nodded grimly. A letter the Colonel tried to destroy. Inspector Graves swore softly. Poirot rose to his feet, expression growing sharper by the moment. Mademoiselle Marple, he said quietly, it is becoming clear that Colonel Harwood was involved in rather serious matters. And someone, Miss Marple added, was afraid of what he might uncover. Poirot turned to the others. This was not an accident, he said. There is a much larger story in this village, and its threads lead deep into Willowbrook's past. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. I believe, Monsieur Poirot, the game has properly begun. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Woods. The mist had almost burned off by noon, leaving the sky a clean, pale blue, and the fields washed in thin sunlight. From a distance, Willowbrook looked perfectly tranquil, cows grazing, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, the church bell marking the hour with its modest, familiar note. But for Miss Marple, the village no longer felt tranquil, it felt watchful. She sat in her small parlour, not knitting this time, but thinking. The image of the locked room, the map with its red ink, the burned fragment of a letter, these hovered in her mind like pieces of a puzzle not yet arranged. A land dispute, an abandoned cottage, a stranger in the woods, and now a dead man by the lake. The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. Miss Marple rose and opened the door to find Inspector Graves standing there, hat in hand, looking both harassed and mildly embarrassed. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "Mind if I come in for a word?" "Of course not, Inspector," she replied. "Do come in. You look as if the world's troubles have parked themselves on your doorstep." "Feels like it," he muttered, stepping inside. "I've just come from speaking with Mr. Alfred Pritchard. He's not pleased with your friend, Monsieur Poirot." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Oh dear, why is that?" Graves sank into a chair, rubbing his forehead. "Poirot visited him this morning about the map, asked rather pointed questions about land ownership and that old cottage in the woods. Pritchard claims the Colonel had been stirring up trouble about boundary lines and that it's all nonsense. But the way he said it," Graves frowned. "It was too quick, too rehearsed, and he's frightened. You can always tell when a man's afraid of something." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, as much for his nerves as for courtesy. "Fear is very informative," she said gently. "People are rarely afraid without cause. What exactly did he say about the Colonel?" "He said Harwood had accused him of taking what wasn't his some years back," Graves replied. "Some bit of land near the woods, apparently no one cared about it until rumours started. Old stories of smuggling, hidden valuables, that sort of thing. Nonsense, if you ask me." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Rumours of hidden valuables are rarely nonsense to those who believe them." Graves snorted. "Well, Pritchard insists he hasn't been near the woods in months. Says he's too busy with his farm." He paused. But his boots told a different story. Mud, fresh. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Monsieur Poirot?" "Off in the woods now," Graves said, determined to see that old cottage for himself. "Asked me to join him, but I've reports to file, and the constable's gone to check train records for any strangers passing through last week. I thought—" he hesitated. "Well, I thought you might perhaps be willing to keep an eye on things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You mean go into the woods and see what your foreign detective is up to?" Graves shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't say that exactly." "No, but you implied it quite nicely," she said. "Very well, Inspector. I was thinking of a little walk, in any case." He looked relieved. "I'll be grateful for anything you notice. Just be careful. If this really is murder, the person responsible might not appreciate curious eyes." Miss Marple saw him to the door. "My dear Inspector," she said softly, "in my experience, the most dangerous eyes are the ones that don't appear curious at all." The path to the woods began just beyond the last row of cottages, where the neat gardens gave way to wild hedgerows and tall grasses. Miss Marple walked at her usual unhurried pace, appearing every inch the harmless elderly lady out for a healthy stroll. Only the keen brightness in her eyes betrayed her true purpose. The trees thickened as she went, their branches knitting together overhead, dimming the light. Birds fluttered through the canopy, sending small showers of leaves to the ground. The smell of damp earth and moss rose strong and cool. She paused once, noticing a broken twig beside the path, and a faint, newer-looking footprint pressed into the soil, narrow, precise, not the clumsy mark of a villager in work boots. She almost smiled. "That will be Monsieur Poirot," she murmured. "Even his footprints look symmetrical." The ground sloped gently upward. After a few more minutes, the path curved, and the trees thinned just enough to reveal it. The cottage sat in a small clearing, hunched and half swallowed by ivy. Its roof slates were dull and broken in places. One shutter hung crooked, the other was missing altogether. The front door was shut, its wood darkened with age and damp. Once it might have been a forester's house, or a smuggler's hideout, or simply a forgotten dwelling. Miss Marple was not surprised to see Hercule Poirot standing in front of it. He was examining the area near the doorstep with intense focus, his hat off, his hair neatly in place despite the woodland air. A small smile touched his lips when he heard her approach. "Ah, mademoiselle," he said without turning, "I had a feeling you might join me." "And I had a feeling you would not resist a lonely cottage in the woods," Miss Marple replied. "Such places are irresistible to the curious mind." Poirot straightened and turned to face her. "There are footprints," he said. "Not only mine. Someone else has been here recently. Two someones, in fact." Miss Marple stepped closer, careful not to disturb the ground. "Show me." Poirot pointed. "Here, a heavier boot. The pattern is similar to that worn by men who work the land, our Mr. Pritchard, perhaps. And here," he indicated a lighter mark near the doorway. "A thinner sole, not local, a town shoe, our mysterious stranger." Miss Marple studied the cottage thoughtfully. "And the door?" "Locked," Poirot said. "But the lock is old. It will not withstand much effort. However," he cleared his throat delicately, "I prefer not to break doors without official permission. It offends my sense of order." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And your sense of legality, perhaps?" "Also that," Poirot admitted. Miss Marple glanced around the clearing. "Locks on front doors are all very well, but in my experience, people who wish to enter houses without being seen rarely choose the front." She walked slowly around the side of the cottage, Poirot following. Ivy clung thickly to the stones, and brambles tugged at her skirt, but she pressed on. Behind the cottage, a small, grimy window sat just above ground level, its pane cracked at the corner. Miss Marple bent down, peering closely. "Look here, Monsieur Poirot." He joined her, squinting. The frame around the window was smeared with a faint mark, like a handprint in dust. "Someone has tried to open it," Poirot said. "Recently." Miss Marple nodded. "And succeeded, I suspect. See the scrape along the sill? Old paint broken? This window has not merely been looked at, it has been used." Poirot's eyes grew sharp. "We must go inside." He straightened and returned to the front door, this time with more determination. From his pocket he produced a small, rather elegant-looking tool. "A memory from a case in Paris," he said, almost apologetically. "Sometimes order must yield to necessity." Miss Marple politely pretended not to see the exact method he used. A few moments later, the lock gave a reluctant click, and the door swung inward with a groan. A chill, stale air greeted them from within. Poirot stepped back. "After you, mademoiselle." "I think not," Miss Marple said mildly. "You are younger and more capable of facing any unpleasant surprises. I shall follow." Poirot hesitated, then nodded and entered, his back straight, his nostrils faintly flared as if bracing against the smell. Miss Marple had the sudden, distinct feeling that once they crossed this threshold, they would find something that would anchor their suspicions beyond any polite doubt. She followed him inside. The cottage's interior was gloomy, the only light coming from the door and the grimy back window. Dust hung in the air, stirred by their movements into drifting patterns. The place smelled of old wood, damp stone, and something else, something sharper, metallic, just at the edge of perception. Poirot moved carefully, his polished shoes incongruously bright against the warped wooden floorboards. Miss Marple let her eyes adjust before taking a single step. She had long ago discovered that the first look at a room was often the truest. A fireplace, long cold, yawned black at one end. A rough wooden table leaned crookedly beneath the window. Two chairs stood beside it, one upright, the other tipped halfway over. Shelves lined one wall, but they were mostly bare, only a few broken jars and an old lantern remained. But it was not the emptiness that drew Miss Marple's attention. It was the recentness. Someone had been there not long ago. A circle, free of dust on the table, told of an object recently removed. The floor showed faint but visible prints where someone had walked back and forth, scuffed, blurred, but undeniably newer than the rest of the dust. And on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a smear of something dark caught the eye. Poirot saw it too. He approached the mantel and leaned close. "Blood," he said quietly. "Not much, but unmistakable." Miss Marple joined him. "So someone was injured here." "Or someone wished us to think so," Poirot replied. "But no, this pattern." He studied the smear carefully. No theatrics, just a hand, perhaps, catching at the mantel for support. He turned, his gaze surveying the room. "Something happened here, mademoiselle, not long ago." Miss Marple's eyes fell on the upturned chair. "A struggle, perhaps. Someone fell, or was pushed." Poirot nodded. "And then?" He moved toward the table, running a gloved finger lightly around the dust-free ring. "Something stood here, something cylindrical, perhaps. A tin, a box, and it has been taken." Miss Marple traced the air above the table, as if seeing the missing object. "Smugglers' tales," she murmured. "Hidden valuables. The village has an excellent memory for romantic nonsense, but occasionally nonsense has a grain of truth." Poirot tapped his finger against his chin. If there was something hidden in this cottage, money, jewels, documents, then it would explain much. The Colonel, he learns of it. Perhaps through old rumors and new maps, he investigates. Someone else, already involved, feels threatened. Murder, then, is not so far a step. Miss Marple looked toward the doorway, her eyes slightly distant. "I wonder who told the first story about this place," she said softly. "Village tales usually begin with one careless tongue and something seen by moonlight." Poirot returned to the center of the room. "Let us think, mademoiselle. Who knew of this cottage? Obviously Mr. Pritchard, the Colonel, the stranger, perhaps more." "Children," Miss Marple added. "They often know more about secret places than anyone else, and boys are very fond of tales about smugglers." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we should speak to the youth of Willowbrook as well." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the floor, where the dust was thickest near the doorway and more disturbed closer to the table. Something caught her eye, a very small, almost insignificant detail. "Ah," she breathed. Poirot was beside her in an instant. "You have seen something, yes?" She pointed delicately with the tip of her shoe. "There, a matchstick, not local." He bent down and picked it up with his handkerchief. The match was half burned, its head charred, but the sliver of wood bore a faint, printed word. Poirot squinted. "The King's Arms," he read. "That is not an inn in Willowbrook, is it?" "No," Miss Marple said, "but there is a King's Arms in Milford, the next town over. Quite a busy place, especially for travellers and salesmen." Poirot's eyes glowed with satisfaction. "Then our stranger did not stay here in the village. He stayed in Milford and came here secretly." "Which fits nicely with someone who argued with the Colonel in public, but did not wish to be known in Willowbrook," Miss Marple said. "He might have thought he could slip in and out unseen." Poirot tucked the matchstick into his notebook. "Nothing leaves so clear a trail as a man who believes he is invisible, mademoiselle." Miss Marple smiled. "Human vanity again." They continued their search. Behind the fireplace, Poirot discovered a loose stone, but whatever had once been hidden there was gone. Miss Marple opened a warped cupboard door to find only cobwebs. In the far corner, beneath a damp patch on the ceiling, a single footprint stood out, a heavier boot mark, pointing toward the door. "Mr. Pritchard, perhaps," Poirot said. "Late to the scene, or early." "Or both," Miss Marple replied. At last, having gathered what they could, they stepped back out into the clearing. The air felt fresher, the light stronger after the cottage's gloom. Poirot locked the door again with careful precision. "We shall tell Inspector Graves what we found," he said. "He will arrange an official search, but for now," his gaze drifted to the trees, where the path wound back toward the village, "we must consider the order of events. Miss Marple folded her hands before her. The Colonel investigates the land boundaries and the cottage. He confronts Mr. Pritchard, and perhaps the stranger as well. He discovers something he was not meant to find. Shortly afterward, he is found dead at the lake. And this cottage, Poirot added, shows signs of a struggle and something removed. The timeline is simple enough, Miss Marple said. The question, as always, is, who wanted him dead enough to push him into the water? Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he looked at her thoughtfully. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Marple," he said, "if you had to choose, based only on what we know your instincts, they would point to whom?" Miss Marple's expression was mild, almost apologetic. "Instincts are only instincts, Monsieur Poirot, but very often the most dangerous person is not the one who shouts, but the one who smiles too much, the one who tries a little too hard to seem ordinary." Poirot nodded slowly. "You have already someone in mind?" "No," she replied. "Not yet, only a shadow." They began walking back along the forest path, side by side. The birds had resumed their song, and the distant sound of the village drifted through the trees, a hammer on wood, a dog barking, a woman calling a child home. As they walked, the peaceful sounds felt almost mocking. They were halfway back to the village when the tranquility shattered. From far off toward the direction of Willow Lake, a voice rose in a scream, a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the afternoon like a knife. Poirot and Miss Marple stopped dead. For a fraction of a second, the woods held their breath. Then Poirot said quietly, "That, mademoiselle, was not fear of rumors. That was fear of something very real." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the strap of her handbag. "I think," she said calmly, though her heart had quickened, "that our peaceful countryside is about to show us just how dark it can become." Together, they hurried toward the source of the scream, toward the lake, and whatever new horror awaited them there. Chapter 4. A Second Death. The scream seemed to hang in the air longer than any human breath could sustain, echoing over the fields, skimming across the surface of Willow Lake, and slicing through the quiet certainty of the afternoon. Birds burst from the trees in a sudden flurry. Somewhere far off, a dog began barking frantically. Poirot and Miss Marple exchanged a single look. "The lake," Poirot said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Again." They moved as quickly as the uneven ground allowed, Poirot lengthening his stride, Miss Marple surprisingly steady for her age, guided as much by instinct as by sound. The path sloped downward, the trees thinning, until the shimmering line of the water came into view. A small crowd had already begun to collect near the shore. In a village, people always moved quickly to the site of distress, as if proximity alone might explain things. A woman stood with her hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide. Two men were bent over something on the ground. Someone shouted for the constable. As Poirot and Miss Marple approached, the cluster of villagers shifted slightly, and the something on the ground became horribly clear. It was a man, youngish, broad-shouldered, still dressed in his work clothes. He lay half on the bank, half in the shallows, one arm submerged. Dark hair plastered his forehead. His cap lay a short distance away in the mud, as if knocked off by sudden impact. Miss Marple recognized him at once. "Thomas Reed," she said quietly, "the postman." The woman who had screamed Mrs. Reed, his wife, turned at the sound of Miss Marple's voice. Her face was blotched with tears, her hair coming loose from its pins. "He's dead," she sobbed. "Just like the Colonel by the lake, just like him. I found him. He should have been home for his dinner. He always comes home." Poirot stepped forward, his expression grave. "Inspector Graves has been sent for?" he asked. "Yes," someone replied. "The boy's gone to fetch him." Poirot knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb more than necessary. His eyes moved over Thomas Reed with quick, precise attention. The angle of the neck, the position of the limbs, the dampness of his clothing, the faint discoloration along the side of his head. Miss Marple watched the villagers instead. She saw shock, certainly, fear, quite understandably. But she also saw something else, something skittering behind a few pairs of eyes like a guilty thought. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition, as if some buried anxiety, half-formed and unspoken, had just taken visible shape. 2 deaths in 2 days, she murmured, and both men whose work brought them near the village's private lives. Poirot looked up. You observe, mademoiselle, that the manner is similar, but not identical. Colonel Harwood's body was found partly hidden in reeds, as though placed. This man, he has the look of someone who fell quickly, without care for concealment. Perhaps the killer had less time, Miss Marple suggested, or felt there was no need to disguise this one. He considered that, then rose, as Inspector Graves arrived at last, red-faced and out of breath, with the constable in tow. "What now?" Graves demanded, even before he reached them. His gaze fell on Thomas Reed and hardened. "Good Lord, not again." Mrs. Reed flung herself toward him. "You have to catch who did this," she cried. "It's not an accident, not 2 of them, not in the same place. It's murder. It must be murder." Graves awkwardly patted her shoulder, his jaw set. "We'll find out what happened, Mrs. Reed. I promise you that." Poirot stepped aside to give the inspector room, but spoke calmly. "There is bruising at the back of the head, Inspector. Similar in position to Colonel Harwood's injury, but the shape is slightly different, and the angle, too. This man may have been struck from behind as he turned." "Turned toward what?" Graves muttered. Poirot glanced at the path leading up from the lake. "Or toward whom?" Miss Marple spoke gently. "Inspector," Thomas Reed delivered letters to almost every house in Willowbrook. He knew who received what and when, and he was trustworthy enough to be told many things people did not say in public. Graves frowned. "You think he knew something about the Colonel's affairs?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that if the Colonel had been investigating land, secrets and old stories, and if someone was anxious enough to kill him, then the man who carried letters might have become nervous. And a nervous man sometimes speaks." Graves swore under his breath. "We'll take the body to Dr. Edwards. He'll examine it." He raised his voice to the crowd. "All of you, clear off now. I'll talk to each of you later. This isn't a spectacle." Slowly, reluctantly, the villagers dispersed, though a few hung back at a distance, whispering. Mrs. Reed allowed herself to be led away by a neighbour, still sobbing. Poirot and Miss Marple remained, silent for a moment, as the constable and another man lifted Thomas Reed's body and carried it toward the road where a cart awaited. "The pattern becomes clearer," Poirot said at last. "I am not sure I like the pattern," Miss Marple replied softly. Poirot's gaze lingered on the wet imprint where Reed's body had lain. "Neither do I, mademoiselle. But murderers rarely arrange their affairs to please us." They walked back toward the village at a slower pace. Midway up the path, they met Alfred Pritchard coming down, his face pale, his hair slightly disordered. "What's all this I hear?" Pritchard demanded. "Another death? By the lake?" "I'm afraid so, Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple said quietly. "Thomas Reed." Pritchard's eyes widened. "Reed? The postman? Good God, what's happening in this place?" His gaze flicked nervously toward Poirot. You don't think this has anything to do with that absurd business about land, do you?" Poirot smiled faintly. "At present, monsieur, I think of many possibilities. That is my habit. It prevents me from making the wrong enemies." Pritchard swallowed, his throat working. "Well, you'll want to talk to people, I suppose, but don't let these stories run wild. There's no sense in frightening everyone over tales and rumors." "On the contrary," Poirot said mildly, "it is often the truth, not the rumor, that is most frightening." Pritchard muttered something under his breath and hurried on toward the lake, perhaps to see what could no longer be seen. Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes thoughtful. "He is very anxious," she observed. "Oui," Poirot agreed. "The question, as always, is, of what?" Back in the village, stone walls seemed suddenly more confining, the streets narrower, the air thicker. News of a second death had already spread. Curtains twitched as they passed. A pair of schoolboys whispered, casting frightened glances at the adults. Someone had drawn their front bolt in the middle of the afternoon. Fear, Miss Marple thought, moves faster than any postman. They parted ways outside her cottage. Poirot, intending to visit Dr. Edwards and Inspector Graves at the surgery, Miss Marple intending something rather different. "I shall pay a call on Mrs. Reed," she said. "There are things a grieving widow might tell another woman that she would not say to a man in a uniform." "An excellent idea," Poirot replied. "I, meanwhile, will learn what the doctor can tell us about how, or perhaps I should say, with what Thomas Reed was struck." He paused, then added, "Take care, mademoiselle." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Oh, I shall. Murderers rarely suspect the elderly of anything more dangerous than misplacing spectacles." Poirot gave a brief, tight nod and turned away. Miss Marple set off in the opposite direction, toward the small cottage where the Reeds lived at the edge of the village. The front door was half open, hanging as though it had lost the will to stand firmly closed. Inside, she could hear muffled voices and the sound of someone crying. She knocked gently and stepped in. Mrs. Reed sat at the kitchen table, hands twisting in a damp handkerchief. Beside her, a stout woman, Mrs. Carter, was murmuring something meant to be comforting and failing utterly. On the stove, water boiled over quietly. "May I come in, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft. Mrs. Reed looked up, eyes red and swollen. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, please." Miss Marple entered, setting the saucepan back from the flame with a practical gesture before taking a seat opposite Thomas Reed's widow. "We're so sorry, all of us," she said. "Thomas was a good man." Mrs. Reed broke into fresh sobs. "He never hurt anyone," she cried. "Always on time with his deliveries, always so careful. Why would anyone? Why would they?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. "Sometimes, my dear, people are hurt not for what they have done, but for what they happen to know." Mrs. Reed blinked, the words trickling through shock and settling somewhere deeper. "What they know?" she repeated. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, almost conversational. "Did Thomas seem troubled these last few days? Anything on his mind?" Mrs. Reed hesitated. Mrs. Carter glanced nervously at Miss Marple, then stood. "I'll make some tea," she said, retreating toward the stove, understanding quite well that her presence would muffle confidences. Mrs. Reed twisted her handkerchief tighter. "He was quieter," she admitted. "Not sleeping well. He said there was too much on his route, too many letters, not enough time. But that's been true for years. This was different." "How so?" Miss Marple asked. "He kept saying he wished people would mind their own business," Mrs. Reed whispered. "That some things were better left alone. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and said it wasn't his place to interfere, only to deliver." Miss Marple felt a tiny, cold knot form in her chest. "And did he mention anyone in particular?" she pressed gently. "Any quarrels? Any letters that upset him?" Mrs. Reed swallowed. "There was one. Last week. He came home looking pale, said he'd delivered a letter to the Colonel from someone in Milford. The next day he had to take another one registered post, he said. He joked that the envelope was heavier than his conscience." Her voice cracked. "I told him he shouldn't talk like that." Miss Marple's fingers tightened briefly on the table edge. "Did he say who the sender was?" Mrs. Reed shook her head miserably. "No, just that it came through Milford. But he said," she took a shuddering breath, "he said, if half of what's written in that letter is true, some people in this village will be sleeping badly soon." Miss Marple's heart gave a small, sharp thud. "I see," she said quietly. Whatever had been written to Colonel Harwood from Milford, Thomas Reed had known just enough about it to be dangerous. And now he was dead. Dr. Edwards's surgery was a narrow building on the village's main street, its front room combining the unpromising air of a waiting room with the faint smell of disinfectant and pipe smoke. The walls were lined with shelves of medical volumes and jars whose contents it was probably better not to inspect too closely. Hercule Poirot sat on a wooden chair by the window, his hands resting on his knees, while Inspector Graves paced back and forth with increasing impatience. "Well?" Graves demanded. "What's the verdict?" Dr. Edwards, a greying man with a tired face and surprisingly sharp eyes, removed his spectacles and polished them on his handkerchief with slow precision. "The verdict," he said, "is that Thomas Reed died from a blow to the back of the head, followed by drowning. The sequence is important." "Meaning?" Graves snapped. "Meaning the blow itself did not kill him outright," Edwards said calmly. "He was struck hard enough to stun or partially incapacitate him. After that, he fell or was pushed into the water and drowned. There is water in the lungs. He was alive when he went in." Poirot nodded slowly. "And the nature of the blow?" "Blunt object," Edwards replied. "Something small but heavy. The wound is narrow, more focused than Colonel Harwood's. I would say, perhaps the edge of a stone or the corner of a tool. A hammer, for instance. Or," he paused, "the metal head of a walking stick." Poirot's eyes flicked up at that. "A walking stick, Doctor?" "Yes," Edwards said. "Many gentlemen's sticks have metal caps, do they not? Enough weight to leave a mark. Speaking of which, I recall the Colonel carried such a stick. Did Mr. Reed?" Graves shook his head. "No, Reed usually had nothing but his sack and his cap." Poirot's gaze turned inward. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting." Graves shoved his hands into his pockets. "So we may be looking for a man with a stick. That narrows it down only slightly. Half the older men in this area own one, even if they don't need it." Poirot ignored the sarcasm. "Tell me, Doctor, how long would you say before he was found?" "Not very long," Edwards said. "An hour, perhaps. The body had not been in the water long enough for full changes to set in. Mrs. Reed's account matches that." "Then someone struck him in broad daylight and left him by the shore," Poirot said softly, "either counting on the appearance of an accident or caring nothing for appearances at all." Graves scowled. "Or they panicked." "Perhaps," Poirot said. "But this was not an impulsive killing, Inspector. Not with the Colonel's death so fresh in everyone's mind. No, no, this second blow. It is strategic. It is the silencing of a loose end." Graves sank into a chair, suddenly looking older. "So we have a murderer who's not only willing to strike twice, but quick to do it. That's the worst kind." "On the contrary, Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "the worst kind are those who are not quick, but patient. But in either case, haste leaves mistakes." "And have you seen any?" Graves asked bleakly. Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the half-burned matchstick from the cottage. He held it between thumb and forefinger. "A murderer who wishes to be invisible," he said, "does not drop matchsticks from other towns. Nor does he choose postmen who carry letters from Milford with interesting contents." Graves eyed the match. "We'll check with the King's Arms in Milford," he said. "See if they had a guest last week who fits this stranger of yours." Poirot inclined his head. "Très bien. Meanwhile, Miss Marple speaks with Mrs. Reed. Between us, we will learn whether the postman said more than he realized." Graves hesitated, then asked quietly, "Do you really think these two deaths are linked? Couldn't the postman have simply slipped?" Poirot turned his gaze on him, gentle but unwavering. "Do you think so, Inspector?" Graves held his eyes for a moment, then looked away. "No," he admitted. "No, I don't." "Then we must proceed as though we are dealing not with accidents, but with a mind," Poirot said. "A mind that feels watched. Cornered, perhaps. Minds in corners are surprisingly resourceful." While Poirot and the inspector spoke of wounds and matchsticks, Miss Marple walked slowly back from the Reeds' cottage, her thoughts as neatly arranged as the rose in her garden. A letter from Milford, registered post, heavy, Thomas Reed had said, and its contents troubling enough that he had made a small joke about consciences. Miss Marple knew the tone well. It was the sort of remark made by a man who senses danger but hopes to laugh it away. She did not think he had succeeded. At the crossroads, she nearly collided with young Mary Fletcher, the grocer's assistant, who was hurrying along with an empty basket and a worried face. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm sorry," Mary exclaimed. "I wasn't looking." "That's quite all right, my dear," Miss Marple said. "Is something the matter?" Mary bit her lip. "It's just, everyone's talking about Mr. Reed. Ma'am says we shouldn't go near the lake at all now. She says it's cursed." Mary shivered. "Do you think that's true?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Lakes themselves are rarely cursed. People, on the other hand, quite often are by their own choices." Mary gave her a nervous, half-understood smile. "You always say things like that, Miss Marple. They sound simple, but they make me think too much." "Thinking is rarely a bad thing," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, Mary, did you notice anything unusual on Thomas Reed's route this week? Any new faces? Unusual letters? You work at the grocer's. You see who comes and goes." Mary hesitated, then glanced around reflexively, as if afraid of being overheard even on an empty road. "Well," she said slowly, "there was a man from Milford here 2 days ago. I saw him talking to Mr. Reed outside the shop." "Did you indeed?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "What sort of man?" "Tidy," Mary said, "like he cared about how he looked. But his shoes were worn. He had a small case with him. I thought he was maybe a salesman, but he didn't go into any of the shops. Just talked to Mr. Reed, and then they walked off a little way together. Mr. Reed looked uncomfortable." "Did you hear anything they said?" Miss Marple asked. Mary shook her head. "Only Mr. Reed saying, 'I just do my job, that's all.' The other man said something I couldn't hear. Then Mr. Reed looked up and saw me, and they stopped talking." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "And did you see where the man went after that?" "No, miss," Mary said, "but I saw him earlier in the day near the post office, talking to Mrs. Wilkes at the counter. He seemed very interested in how registered letters work." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly she ticked another box. A stranger from Milford, interested in registered post, speaking to the postmistress and the postman, a heavy envelope addressed to Colonel Harwood. "Yes," she thought, "the pattern grows clearer indeed." As afternoon slanted toward evening, the cottage curtains of Willowbrook glowed softly against the lowering sky. Miss Marple sat once more by her sitting-room window, her knitting needles idle in her lap. On the small table beside her lay a notepad on which she had, most unusually for herself, written a list of names: Colonel Harwood, Alfred Pritchard, Thomas Reed, Mrs. Finch, stranger from Milford. She regarded the list as if it were a row of characters in some village play, each waiting to speak their lines. There was a story tying them together of land, of letters, of an old cottage, of something hidden and something discovered. She could feel the shape of it now, like furniture in a darkened room. One could avoid bumping into things if one knew where they were. She only lacked the lamp. There was a knock on her door. She rose and opened it to find Hercule Poirot standing there, his face thoughtful, his eyes bright, with the particular light of a man following a trail. "Good evening, Mademoiselle Marple," he said. "I come to report and to listen." "Both are very welcome," Miss Marple replied. "I have a few small reports of my own." They sat opposite each other, like two players at a chessboard, though no pieces were visible. Poirot told her of Dr. Edwards' findings, the nature of the blow, the likely weapon, the certainty of drowning. Miss Marple told him of Mrs. Reed's words, of the registered letter from Milford, of the stranger questioning Mrs. Wilkes and speaking with Thomas Reed. When they had finished, silence settled over the room for a long moment. "At least we may be sure," Poirot said at last, "that the Colonel's death and the postman's are connected. The letter from Milford ties them together." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Whatever was in that letter, and whatever the Colonel did or threatened to do because of it, someone decided it was worth killing twice over." Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingers. "The enemy of our Colonel, he is clever and determined, but he has made a mistake." Miss Marple looked at him with mild interest. "Already?" Poirot smiled very slightly. "Oui. He has assumed that a small village cannot contain very sharp eyes. He knows of Inspector Graves. He knows, perhaps, of Hercule Poirot. But I do not think he has yet understood about Miss Jane Marple." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, amused smile. "People rarely do at first. It is one of life's minor advantages." Poirot's tone grew thoughtful. "We must go to Milford, you and I, very soon, to the King's Arms, to the post office there, and perhaps to one or two people who do not wish to be seen in Willowbrook at all." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "because the countryside has many paths. Some of them lead away from the village, but the trouble always comes back." Outside, the evening deepened. Within, two minds, very different and strangely alike, turned quietly toward the same dark center. Somewhere between Willowbrook and Milford, between the old cottage and the smooth face of the lake, a killer moved along familiar paths, believing themselves clever and unseen. For the moment. That illusion, Poirot and Miss Marple both knew, would not last forever. Chapter 5. The Trap is Set. The next morning broke with a dull, colorless light, as if the sky itself were tired of watching events unfold in Willowbrook. A low haze hung over the fields. The trees stood still and listening. It was not a cheerful day for travel, but travel was precisely what Hercule Poirot had in mind. Miss Marple stood at her gate, her small gloved hands folded neatly on the handle of her handbag, as Poirot approached from the lane. He was, as always, perfectly turned out, suit pressed, hat precise, moustache immaculate. A small valise hung from his hand. "You are ready, mademoiselle?" he asked. "As ready as one can be to go hunting for trouble," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Milford isn't so very far, but I fancy we shall learn things there that no one in Willowbrook will be pleased to hear." Poirot gave a short, satisfied nod. "Then we must learn them all the more quickly." Inspector Graves met them at the corner, looking harassed but determined. "I've arranged for a car," he said without preamble. "It's waiting by the inn. I'm coming with you, of course. If there's a man in Milford tied to 2 murders in my village, I intend to hear his name myself." "Mais naturellement," Poirot said. "You will be our official authority. Miss Marple and I will merely be, how do you say, attentive listeners." Graves snorted. "That's what worries me." The car, a somewhat battered vehicle belonging to a local farmer who occasionally hired it out, rattled them along the narrow road between village and town. Fields rolled past on either side, hedges blurring into green-grey streaks. Now and then they passed a solitary figure walking, or a cart, but for the most part the road was empty. Miss Marple watched the landscape thoughtfully. "Such a short distance," she remarked, "and yet how very far some people imagine it to be, as though what happens in Milford cannot possibly become known in Willowbrook." "And yet it does," Poirot said softly, "through letters, through whispers, through men like Thomas Reed." Graves stared grimly ahead. "If this stranger of yours is sitting comfortably in Milford now, after what's happened." Miss Marple shook her head. "I doubt he is comfortable anywhere, Inspector. Men who start trouble in small places rarely find rest in larger ones." Milford announced itself with chimneys, shop fronts, and the muddled energy of a busier town. The car rattled into the square and stopped near a fountain whose stone nymph looked permanently affronted by pigeons. Graves turned to the others. "First the King's Arms?" Poirot inclined his head. "Oui. Our matchstick leads us there." The King's Arms was a respectable inn with ambitions of grandeur, red velvet curtains faded by the sun, brass polished just enough to suggest effort, and a landlord with the solemn dignity of a man who knew the value of discretion. He looked up as they entered. "Morning, Inspector," he said. "What brings you to Milford?" "Questions," Graves replied. "About a guest you had, last week or the week before. A man who used matches with your inn's name printed on them." He placed the half-burned matchstick on the counter. The landlord picked it up, squinting. "Ah, yes, that's ours, right enough. We hand them out to guests who ask. Helps them remember where they were, I suppose." "Do you recall a guest from out of town?" Poirot asked, his tone polite but focused. "Who stayed here and travelled to Willowbrook?" "A gentleman, perhaps in his 40s. careful in his appearance, but somewhat worn at the edges. The landlord frowned in concentration. We get our fair share of commercial travellers. But Willowbrook, you say? He rubbed his chin. There was a Mr. Blake, Henry Blake. Came in about a week ago, stayed 2 nights, went out both days, said he was visiting a client in a nearby village, paid in cash. Didn't say where he was from, but he had the look of a man who'd seen better hotels. Graves leaned forward. Did he leave an address? Any note? Just signed the register. The landlord reached under the desk and produced a battered book. He flipped it open to a page filled with looping signatures and dates. One neat entry stood out among the scrawls. Henry Blake, London, room 3. 2 nights. Poirot studied the signature closely, as if the ink itself might confess something. Did he receive post here? He asked. 2 letters, the landlord said. Both redirected from London, I think. He asked every morning if anything had arrived. Nervous sort, bit too quick to smile. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And did he send post? The landlord hesitated, impressed, and faintly uneasy. Now that you mention it, yes, he asked for paper and an envelope, wrote something in the corner there. He pointed to a small table by the window, then went out and posted it himself. I remember because he asked me where the nearest post office was. Poirot and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. That would be the letter to Colonel Harwood, the heavy, registered one Thomas Reed joked about. Graves straightened. Can you describe Blake more precisely? The landlord complied as best he could. Medium height, thinning dark hair, decent suit, a walking stick with a metal cap, distinctive but not unusual. Do you know where he went when he left? Graves pressed. No idea, the landlord said. He checked out early before breakfast, left no message. But, he frowned suddenly. Come to think of it, there was something odd. The night before he left, he came back late, had mud on his shoes, looked shaken, went straight up to his room without a word. Next morning, gone. Mud, Poirot repeated quietly. From a path by a lake, perhaps, or from the woods near an abandoned cottage. Miss Marple's voice was very calm. Did he seem like a man who had achieved what he came to do, or failed? The landlord considered. Failed, he said at last. Definitely failed. Poirot nodded, as though this confirmed something already half-formed in his mind. Merci, monsieur, he said. You have been most helpful. If Mr. Blake returns, you will inform Inspector Graves at once, yes? The landlord swallowed. You think he's mixed up in whatever this business is? I think, Poirot said gently, that he is a thread, and we are very close now to seeing what tapestry it belongs to. From the King's Arms they went next to the Milford post office, a busier, more anonymous place than Willowbrook's. Behind the counter stood a brisk woman with spectacles, sorting letters with practiced speed. Graves showed his badge. We're making inquiries about a registered letter sent last week to Colonel Harwood of Willowbrook, he said. It would have been posted here, likely by a Mr. Henry Blake. The postmistress pursed her lips. Registered letters are recorded, she said, though I can't show you everything, of course. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his tone courteous. Madame, 2 men are dead. We seek only the truth, not to trouble innocent people. That softened her. She pulled a ledger closer, running her finger down a column. Here we are. Registered letter, posted 4 days ago. Addressed to Colonel Arthur Harwood, Willowbrook. Sender, she squinted, H. Blake, London. Is there any note as to return address? Poirot asked. Just C.O. King's Arms, Milford, she said. Temporary lodgings, that sort of thing. We get a fair number of those. And the fee? Poirot asked. Was there anything unusual? She shook her head. Standard registration, but, she hesitated. He did seem particularly anxious about proof of delivery, kept asking how someone could know for certain that the letter reached the right hands, wanted reassurance that no one else could sign for it. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. So Mr. Blake was very concerned that Colonel Harwood personally would receive the letter. That suggests its contents were either incriminating or dangerous. Graves exhaled slowly. "We're going in circles," he muttered. "We know the letter existed, we know it reached the Colonel, we know it upset Thomas Reed, and we know the Colonel burned at least part of it, but we still don't know what it said." Poirot's expression grew suddenly more decided. "Then, Inspector," he said, "we must make someone believe that we do know." Miss Marple looked at him with interest. "Ah, I see." Her eyes grew thoughtful. "Yes, that would be quite an effective way to discover who is most afraid." Graves stared between them. "What are you two plotting now?" Poirot smiled, a smile without humour. "Not plotting, Inspector. Planning. There is a murderer in Willowbrook who believes he has removed all traces of that letter. We must convince him that he is wrong." "And then?" Graves asked. "And then," Poirot said quietly, "we shall see what he does when he thinks his secret is about to be read aloud." By late afternoon, they were back in Willowbrook. The village seemed even smaller, after Milford, its lanes narrower, its cottages closer together, its whispers louder. The news of their trip had not yet spread, but the mood in the air had changed in another way. Doors were more firmly closed, children kept closer to home, and conversation stopped when Poirot or Inspector Graves passed by. People, Miss Marple thought, had begun to feel hunted. Unfortunately for at least one of them, they were right. They gathered in Inspector Graves's small office, which smelled of paper, ink, and a faint hint of pipe tobacco. Poirot stood by the window, looking out at the square. Miss Marple sat calmly in a wooden chair, hands folded. Graves leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Well?" Graves asked. "Suppose we do as you say, pretend we have more than we do. How exactly does that catch a killer?" Poirot turned from the window. "It is very simple, Inspector. We give him something to fear, a deadline, if you will. Murderers fear time when they think it is running out." "And what are we using as bait?" Graves demanded. "The letter," Poirot replied. "We will announce that a portion of it has been recovered, that it names, that it will be read aloud tomorrow evening at Colonel Harwood's house, in your presence, Inspector, and before certain witnesses." Miss Marple nodded. "If the killer believes there is a chance his name or his accomplices will be heard, he will not sit quietly by and wait. He will act." Graves frowned. "Act how? Run? Hide? Kill again?" Poirot's voice was calm. "Perhaps. But this time he will move in a space we have prepared, under eyes that are truly watching." Miss Marple added gently, "At present, Inspector, we are reacting to his moves. It is time he reacted to ours." Graves rubbed his face, resisting and yet clearly seeing the logic. "All right," he said at last. "Say we do it your way. What exactly do we tell people?" Poirot sat down, folding his hands neatly. "We shall begin with Mrs. Finch," he said. "The housekeeper. Word always travels fastest from those who are most inclined to talk, whether they mean to or not." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mrs. Finch does try very hard not to gossip, which only makes what she does say seem all the more important." "And after that," Poirot continued, "we let a few carefully chosen details slip at the grocer's, the post office, the inn, nothing too precise. Only that a fragment of the letter has been found in Colonel Harwood's locked room, and that it will be read tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock in the Colonel's study, with the inspector present." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And we shall make it clear that certain people are specifically invited, I assume?" "Precisely," Poirot said. "Mr. Pritchard, of course, Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Wilkes, who handled the registered letter here, and perhaps one or two others who will be useful witnesses." Graves eyed him. "And you expect the murderer to do what? March up and confess before 7? Poirot's eyes glinted. "No, Inspector. I expect him either to attempt to steal or destroy this supposed fragment, or to prevent the meeting altogether. In either case, he will expose himself." "And if he does nothing?" Graves asked. "Then we have lost very little," Poirot said serenely. "But I do not think he will sit idly by. He has already killed twice to protect this secret. He will not stop now because we give it a new, more public life. Graves exhaled. Very well, we do it your way. But I'll have men posted near the Colonel's house, and I'll not have any civilian wandering about alone. Miss Marple's expression remained pleasant. I shall stay exactly where you put me, Inspector, very likely in plain sight where I am most useful. They began at Colonel Harwood's house. Mrs. Finch opened the door with her usual nervous wringing of hands. "Oh, Inspector, Monsieur Poirot, Miss Marple, has there been more bad news?" "On the contrary, Mrs. Finch," Poirot said gently. "There has been a development. May we come in?" In the Colonel's study, the map still lay on the desk, weighted down now by 2 paperweights, for fear some helpful constable might tidy it away. The room felt like a stage awaiting its actors. Poirot looked around, as if reassuring himself that everything was in place. "Mrs. Finch," he said, turning to the housekeeper, during a more thorough examination of the locked room upstairs, "something was found among the burned papers in the grate." Her eyes widened. "Found? But I thought—" "A small, partially burned piece of the letter Colonel Harwood received from Mr. Blake," Poirot lied smoothly. "Just enough to indicate that the letter referred to events in Willowbrook more than 20 years ago and to certain actions taken by specific people." Mrs. Finch went pale. "Names?" "Perhaps," Poirot said. "We cannot yet be sure. The writing is faint, and Dr. Edwards is assisting us in making it clearer. But we expect to know more by tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow?" she whispered. "Yes," Poirot said. "At 7 o'clock, here in this room, we will gather a few people who were connected with the Colonel's recent affairs. Inspector Graves will be present. We shall discuss what the letter contained and whom it may implicate." Mrs. Finch swallowed. Who will be here?" Poirot listed them calmly. "Yourself, Mr. Pritchard, Mrs. Wilkes, perhaps 1 or 2 others. We wish to ensure that all those who might be affected by Colonel Harwood's discoveries have the opportunity to hear what remains of the letter." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Finch's face carefully. "Fear, yes, but also something more complicated. A guilty knowledge, perhaps, or the terror of someone who had overheard more than she should long ago." I see," Mrs. Finch managed. I'll be here, of course." "I am sure you will," Poirot said. As they left, Miss Marple leaned closer to him. "She knows more than she has said," she murmured. "Oui," Poirot replied. "But whether it is knowledge of guilt or of history, we shall soon learn." Next came Mrs. Wilkes at the post office, Mrs. Hargreaves at the bakery, Mr. Pritchard encountered conveniently near his farm gate. In each conversation, Poirot and Miss Marple dropped the same small stone into the still pond of village life. A fragment of the letter has been found. Names may be revealed. There will be a meeting tomorrow at 7. The ripples spread rapidly, just as they had intended. By late afternoon, Willowbrook's atmosphere had changed again. Not merely fearful now, but tense. People walked more quickly. Some avoided certain lanes. Others lingered in doorways, clearly wanting to speak and not daring to. Only Alfred Pritchard reacted with open anger. "This is ridiculous, Inspector," he snapped when Graves informed him formally of the meeting. "Dragging people into the dead man's house over some half-burned scrap of paper. It's nothing but theatrics. If Harwood had a complaint against me, he could have made it in life instead of keeping secrets in death." "Nevertheless," Graves said, "you'll be there, or I'll make a note of your refusal in my report." Pritchard glared at him, then at Poirot. His eyes slid briefly toward Miss Marple, as if judging whether she was worth fearing. "I'll be there," he said through his teeth, "and I'll be very interested to hear what this supposed fragment actually says." He stalked away, his shoulders tight. Poirot watched him go. "He is very close to breaking," he murmured. "Or to doing something very foolish," Miss Marple replied. "Which, for our purposes," Poirot said quietly, "amounts to the same thing." That evening, as dusk crept over Willowbrook and lamps flickered to life one by one, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, knitting abandoned beside her. She was not thinking of the cardigan, nor of the baby it was intended for. She was thinking of men like Henry Blake, who stirred old secrets for money, and men like Alfred Pritchard, who buried them on stolen land. She was thinking of colonels who pried where others preferred silence, and postmen who walked too many roads and saw too many doors. Most of all, she was thinking of tomorrow at 7 o'clock, and the fact that somewhere in the village a murderer now believed his safety depended on one final act. She doubted very much that he intended to sit quietly by the fire and wait. Across the square, in his room at the inn, Hercule Poirot laid out his possessions with his usual precision, then sat at the small desk and wrote a single sentence on a blank card. He slid it into an envelope and placed it carefully in his pocket. It was not, in truth, a fragment of Colonel Harwood's letter, but to a guilty man it might look very much like one. "The trap," he said softly to the empty room, "is set." And in the quiet houses of Willowbrook, doors were bolted, curtains drawn, and a long, restless night began. Chapter 6. Truth in the Shadows. The following evening arrived thick with tension, as though the very air of Willowbrook had learned to hold its breath. A muted grey hung over the village, and the chill of late dusk pressed close against the windows of Colonel Harwood's stone house. Inside, lamps had been lit in the study. Their yellow glow played across the heavy oak desk, the map with its red markings, the fireplace where embers smouldered, and the semicircle of chairs that Inspector Graves had arranged with soldierly precision. Miss Marple arrived precisely 5 minutes before 7, as was her custom in all formal matters. Hercule Poirot was already there, hands folded behind his back, eyes gleaming with quiet anticipation. Inspector Graves stood near the door, looking more like a man preparing for a storm than a meeting. The first to arrive was Mrs. Finch, her face drawn and pale. She perched on the edge of her chair, fingers twisting her apron repeatedly. Behind her came Mrs. Wilkes from the post office, her round spectacles glinting nervously in the lamplight. 2 constables settled discreetly by the walls. Then Alfred Pritchard strode in. He looked tense, cheeks flushed with anger or worry, perhaps both. His jaw was set, and his boots thudded heavily on the polished floor. "Let's get this over with," he snapped. "I don't see why half the village should be dragged into the Colonel's private affairs." Poirot bowed courteously. "Monsieur Pritchard, I assure you, we do not seek to cause discomfort, only to reveal the truth." Pritchard snorted. "Truth? Truth is that Harwood was meddling in matters that didn't concern him. Now he's dead, and half the village is jumping at ghosts." Miss Marple observed him quietly. "Anger, yes, but also fear. The fear of a man who feels something tightening around him." When the clock struck 7, Poirot stepped forward. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we have gathered here because a fragment of Colonel Harwood's letter has been, how shall we say, rediscovered." At this, every person in the room stiffened except Miss Marple, who watched for reactions more than words. Poirot drew a small envelope from his pocket with theatrical precision. "What this fragment contains," he continued, "may shed light upon the Colonel's final days and upon the deaths that followed." Pritchard leaned forward sharply. "What does it say?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Patience, monsieur. First we must reconstruct the events." He placed the envelope on the desk, but did not open it. "Colonel Harwood," Poirot said, "received a registered letter from Milford, a heavy letter, a letter that troubled Thomas Reed enough to comment upon it, a letter he then destroyed, but not completely." "The Colonel burned it," Mrs. Finch whispered. "In that room upstairs. I saw the ashes." Poirot inclined his head. "And yet, one small piece remained, enough to suggest that the letter described events from 20 years ago involving property, deception, and the concealment of stolen goods." Pritchard jerked upright. "Stolen goods? What nonsense is this?" "Is it nonsense?" Poirot asked mildly. "The abandoned cottage in the woods was used for storage long ago. Smugglers, perhaps not uncommon in rural England, but at some point Something of value remained hidden there. Inspector Graves nodded. That cottage was visited recently. We found signs. Someone's been inside, and not just once. Poirot continued. Colonel Harwood discovered the truth last week, or perhaps he merely stumbled upon enough of it to become dangerous. He confronted someone who feared exposure. Mrs. Wilkes clasped her hands tightly. Is that why he was killed? Yes, Poirot said softly. I believe so. A hush fell over the room. And Thomas Reed, Poirot went on, delivered the registered letter. He recognized enough of its contents to become nervous, and when he spoke too openly, too innocently, he too became a liability. Mrs. Finch let out a small cry. Oh, the poor man. 2 deaths, Pritchard snapped. And you're saying they're connected? That's absurd. Poirot looked at him steadily. On the contrary, monsieur, they are intimately connected. Both men died because of what they knew or what someone believed they knew. Pritchard shifted in his chair, colour draining slightly from his cheeks. Poirot stepped closer to the desk. And now, he said, we come to the fragment. The room tightened. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, observing each face with calm precision. Mrs. Finch trembling, Mrs. Wilkes rigid, Pritchard on edge, vibrating with anxious hostility. The constables alert. Graves tense. Poirot picked up the envelope, turned it slowly in his fingers, and then he did not open it. Instead, he spoke clearly. The fragment contains 2 letters, 2 initials, enough to frighten the guilty. I want to see it, Pritchard said sharply, rising halfway from his seat. Poirot raised a hand. All in good time. But first, we must consider something else, something very small, very simple, and very revealing. He moved toward the map on the desk. This map, Poirot said, was drawn by the Colonel, but he did not draw it alone. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed, she said, the Colonel was many things, but not a man who enjoyed walking through damp woods with muddy boots. Poirot nodded. Exactly so. Someone guided him. Someone who knew the woods well. Someone who knew the cottage even better. He paused. Someone who visited that cottage last week and left a trace. Pritchard swallowed. What trace? Poirot turned to Graves. Inspector, would you be so kind as to bring in Sergeant Miller? Graves blinked. Miller? Why? Before he could finish, the door opened. Sergeant Miller entered, holding a small paper packet. Poirot accepted it and opened it carefully. Inside was a metal-headed walking stick cap, dented slightly. Poirot held it up. This, he said, was found behind the cottage, freshly loosened from a stick after a heavy blow, the same type that caused the injury to Thomas Reed. Mrs. Finch gasped. Mrs. Wilkes covered her mouth. Pritchard went white. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper that filled the room. And only one man in this room carries such a stick and was seen with it last week. All eyes turned to Alfred Pritchard. He stared at Poirot, rage and terror warring in his face. How dare you? He shouted. That proves nothing. Miss Marple spoke then quietly, but with devastating clarity. Mr. Pritchard, she said, you cleaned your boots this morning, but you missed a small patch of mud at the heel, mud from the woods, from the very path leading to the cottage. Poirot nodded. And when confronted earlier today, you were too quick, too defensive. A man innocent of past wrongdoing does not fear a burned fragment of a letter. Pritchard backed away, breathing hard. You don't know anything. Oh, but we do, Miss Marple said, folding her hands. The Colonel found evidence that you had stolen property rights years ago, and Mr. Blake, whom you paid to keep quiet, decided to blackmail you. The Colonel tried to put matters right, so you killed him, and when Thomas Reed delivered the letter, and perhaps said too much. Poirot finished quietly. You silenced him too. There was no escape left. Pritchard lunged for the door, but the constables were already there. He collapsed between them, all strength leaving him. Poirot looked at Miss Marple. Mademoiselle, he said softly, you saw what even I missed, the human truth. Miss Marple smiled. People, Monsieur Poirot, are often untidy. They leave little clues everywhere. One only has to look." The confession did not come all at once. Alfred Pritchard resisted fiercely, clinging to silence as though it were the last thing he truly possessed. But murderers, Poirot liked to say, unravel under pressure like poorly spun thread, and Pritchard, despite his stubbornness, began to fray. Inspector Graves escorted him to the adjacent parlour, where 2 constables stood guard. The door closed behind them, leaving Poirot and Miss Marple alone in the study for a brief moment. Poirot exhaled, smoothing the sleeves of his coat. "We have begun to see the shape of the story," he said, "but the details, they will be important." Miss Marple nodded. "They always are." Moments later, Inspector Graves returned, his expression somewhere between grim satisfaction and weary disbelief. "He's talking," Graves said. "Or rather, he's breaking. Says he wants a solicitor, but he knows he's caught." Poirot tapped a finger against the back of a chair. "He will give us the truth, and with his truth we shall complete the picture." And indeed, within the hour, Alfred Pritchard's story emerged in shuddering pieces. 23 years earlier, Pritchard had come across a cache of smuggled goods hidden in the abandoned cottage jewellery, foreign coins, a small carved box containing papers in a foreign language. The items had likely been left there for collection by thieves who never returned. Pritchard had taken them. Not all at once, not impulsively, bit by bit, as though the cottage itself were a bank account he felt entitled to withdraw from. He sold the valuables quietly over the years, keeping enough profit to expand his land holdings. He bribed a surveyor to alter boundary maps. He intimidated a neighbour into silence. No one suspected, until Colonel Harwood arrived. The colonel, meticulous and upright, took interest in the land boundaries. He asked questions, too many questions. His military sense of order left no room for conveniently shifting fences and altered lines. And then, Henry Blake. Blake had been a petty swindler in London, down on his luck, looking for quick money. He stumbled across the old smuggling story through an acquaintance and tracked it to Milford. By chance, or perhaps by design, he arrived in Willowbrook at exactly the wrong moment. He overheard the colonel's questions. He saw Pritchard's unease. He realized there was something valuable still at stake. "You found something years ago," Blake said to Pritchard, cornering him one evening on the road to the post office. "Something that wasn't yours, and you've profited from it ever since." Pritchard tried to bluff, then to threaten, but Blake had already sent the registered letter from Milford to the colonel, hinting at what he knew. He expected a payoff. Pritchard panicked. He struck Blake near the cottage during their next meeting hard enough to scare, not kill. He fled, expecting Blake to run. But Blake did not run. He went back to Milford, regrouping, intending to return for more money. Meanwhile, Colonel Harwood had found the altered documents and confronted Pritchard on the path near the lake. The argument grew heated. Pritchard pushed him. The colonel fell, his head striking a stone, and rolled into the water. The second murder happened because Thomas Reed had seen too much. Reed delivered the registered letter. He overheard enough to suspect the colonel's death was not an accident. And he confided his worries to the wrong person, Pritchard himself, whom he happened to pass by on his route. He said he wished people would mind their own business, Mrs. Reed had said. Now the meaning was painfully clear. Pritchard silenced him with the metal-tipped walking stick. "He planned it quickly," Graves said, returning to the study after another round of questioning. "But that's why he made mistakes. The matchstick, the mud, the dented cap, and the panic in his face when you mentioned the letter." Poirot nodded. "Murderers, Inspector, often imagine themselves clever, but guilt, it has a way of making fools of even the sharpest minds." Miss Marple stood quietly by the fireplace, her hands resting lightly on the mantel. "Poor Thomas Reed," she murmured. "A young man simply doing his work. He never knew the danger he walked into." Poirot bowed his head. "We will ensure justice for him, and for the colonel." Inspector Graves blew out a tired breath. "You two may have strange methods, but I'll admit they work. If not for your trap, he'd still be smiling at us over his gate." Poirot smiled gently. "Merci, Inspector, but much of the credit belongs to Miss Marple." Miss Marple blinked modestly. "Oh, I only notice things. People are not nearly as mysterious as they believe." "No," Poirot said, "but they are endlessly surprising." When the formalities ended and the constables escorted Pritchard to the station, Willowbrook settled into a silence that felt exhausted rather than peaceful. The village had been shaken, stripped of illusions, and made to look at shadows it had long ignored. Miss Marple walked home through the cool night, her steps slow but steady. She paused once beneath a lamppost and looked back at the village square, glowing faintly beneath the moon. The countryside, she thought, was never as quiet as it appeared. Beneath its neat hedges and polished tea-sets, people carried their jealousies, fears, old resentments, and hidden crimes just as fiercely as in any city street. The only difference was that in a village you could see their front doors more clearly. Poirot joined her briefly at the corner. "A complicated case, mademoiselle," he said, "and yet solved by the simplest details." "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied. "Footprints, mud, a walking stick, and a guilty conscience trying very hard to appear ordinary." Poirot tipped his hat. "Until next time, Miss Marple." She smiled. "Until next time, Monsieur Poirot." They parted two very different minds, both brilliant in their own ways, both necessary to untangle the darkness that had crept over Willowbrook. And as Miss Marple reached her gate, she saw the sky clearing, a single bright star appearing above the roofs. The village would settle again. New gossip would replace the old. The cottage in the woods would fall silent once more. But the truth had been found. And that, she thought, adjusting her spectacles, was all that mattered. Candlelight Mystery Message. As the lamps of Willowbrook flicker low and the night folds softly over the village, our story's final shadows drift away. Justice has found its voice, and the truth, quiet, patient, and persistent, has stepped fully into the light. Miss Marple returns to her knitting, Poirot to his immaculate order, and the village breathes again, wiser for the secrets it has learned to release. The lake lies still, no longer holding whispers of fear, and the old cottage sinks back into silence, its mysteries finally laid to rest. Thank you for walking beside us through winding lanes, fog-stained woods, and whispered suspicions. In every quiet place, a story waits for a candle to be lit, and for someone brave enough to follow the glow. Until the next tale, keep your candle burning. The shadows always listen.